The world held its breath as the Trooping the Color ceremony unfolded along the mall. Crowds pressed behind iron barricades, waving flags and clutching their phones, the summer air shimmering with excitement and the distant possibility of rain. Soldiers moved in perfect rhythm, scarlet uniforms gleaming, black boots like polished obsidian, the brass of their instruments flashing with every step. But none shone brighter than Valiant, the legendary drum horse at the very front. His white coat was spotless, almost luminous against the gray London sky, and the silver harness on his back sparkled with every deliberate stride. The drummer atop him beat out the ancient rhythm, but it was Valiant who set the pace, head high, eyes fixed forward, exuding the kind of noble composure that demanded attention. He wasn't just a horse, he was a living emblem, a creature raised on the pulse of tradition, a legend among men. Whispers about him ran through the regiment. Some called him the King's Shadow. Others claimed he'd never spooked once in a decade, not even when cannons fired or crowds surged. Little children leaned over the rails, pointing at Valiant, gasping as his mane tossed in the breeze, as if even the wind itself dared not ruffle him. The older officers exchanged knowing looks. This was the Household Cavalry's pride. And yet, beneath all the fanfare, the air was charged with tension. The Queen herself watched from the palace balcony. Security was tighter than ever. Something in the crowd's electric murmur felt just a little off, the way the light changed suddenly as a cloud drifted across the sun. It happened in an instant. A flash of color at the edge, a young protester, face obscured by a hood, slipped past the first layer of security. There was a quick, desperate scuffle, the slap of running feet on wet pavement. Suddenly, a pop, sharp as a firecracker. A canister arced high, spinning end over end. It clattered near the barricades, and with a hiss, thick purple smoke exploded upward, swallowing faces and uniforms in a wild, roiling cloud. Everything that followed seemed to slow down. The other horses startled, whites showing in their eyes, hooves clattering, some shying sideways in panic. Soldiers barked orders, "Hold fast, hold steady." But chaos had already found its way in. Even the drummer on Valiant's back flinched, nearly dropping his sticks. But Valiant stood his ground, head up, refusing to yield to fear, even as his heart thundered in his chest. For a moment, he was the only pillar of order in a sea of confusion. But fate can be crueler than any enemy. Rain, sudden and unrelenting, had swept over London earlier, slicking the ancient stones and the modern fixtures. Beneath Valiant's next step lay a round metal manhole cover, nearly invisible under the shallow puddles and trampled confetti. As he planted his hoof, the metal betrayed him. His legs slipped out from under him, the full weight of his massive frame twisting in the air. In that split second, a million eyes watched as a legend began to fall. It wasn't just a collapse, it was a tragedy in motion. Valiant's hind leg bent at a terrible angle, a sickening sound that cut through the smoke and the screams. His body lurched, the drummer thrown sideways but saved by the quick reflexes of a nearby guardsman. Silence fell. No one moved. The crowd's noise faded away, replaced by a single low groan from Valiant, a sound so raw and full of confusion that it seemed to shake even the oldest officers. The camera zoomed in. If you were there, you'd have seen it, on his eyes, wide with pain, pride turning to helplessness in an instant. A legend's career over in 3 seconds. The ceremony continued, as it always must. But Valiant was gently, almost reverently, led away by a pair of handlers. Soldiers kept their faces stoic, but a few young troopers wiped tears from their cheeks as the parade moved on without its heart. The press would later call it an unfortunate accident, but those who understood, the real cavalrymen, knew a king had been deposed. Time passed in strange, uncertain measures for Valiant. The next images in his story were nothing like the gleaming parades. He arrived at an animal sanctuary far outside the city. No more harness, no more shining metals, just a long scar down his hind leg, the hair never quite growing back right, and a limp that deepened with every step. The other horses, once his loyal subjects, now kept their distance. To them, he was no longer the alpha, no longer worthy of respect. He stood alone in a muddy paddock, head low, the rain turning his white coat dull and patchy. There were days when he refused to eat, days when he flinched at the approach of any human hand. Sometimes, in the cold mornings, the sanctuary staff would find him standing in the farthest corner, eyes fixed on some point in the distance, silent and unmoving, as if waiting for something he could never name. The legend had become an exile. The king, stripped of his crown, was now just another forgotten soul at the edge of the world. But deep within Valiant, behind the pain, behind the scars, something small and bright refused to die out. In his dreams, sometimes, he still heard the drums, still saw the cheering crowds, still felt the pride of being truly seen. Somewhere beyond the fences, beyond the paddocks, the world moved on, but Valiant remained, caught between memory and loss, a broken king still longing somehow for one last note of glory. Across town, in the faded blue light of early morning, Leo awoke to the sharp buzz of the care home's old fluorescent bulbs. The place never really slept. It just drifted through cycles of tiredness and noise. Leo wasn't new here, but he'd learned quickly how to make himself invisible. He slipped through the halls, hands in his pockets, head down, a shadow moving past the other kids who traded taunts and half-hearted punches over breakfast trays. Most people didn't know what to do with him. He didn't get in trouble, not really, but he never smiled, never argued, never played the games everyone else seemed to know. Some staff whispered that Leo was difficult, not because he lashed out, but because he didn't react at all. Sometimes he'd just sit by the window for hours, staring out at nothing, his eyes reflecting something older than a boy's should. He kept to himself, always watching, always waiting. The other kids, sensing his difference, circled him like sharks around a drifting seal. At school, it was worse. If he brought a book to class, it would get stolen or torn up. If he said something strange, if he said anything at all, someone would laugh. So he stopped trying. The only place Leo felt remotely comfortable was outside, under the gray English sky. He'd sneak out when he could, always careful, always quiet. He knew the streets, the bus schedules, the quiet spots in the city where the world seemed to pause for breath. He had one special place, though, a place he'd found by accident the year before, on a morning when the noise in the care home had gotten too much. At the edge of the city, where the buildings fell away to fields and hedges, stood a small animal sanctuary. The sign out front was peeling, the letters faded, but the land beyond the gate was wide and green. He'd never had the courage to go inside, but sometimes he'd climb the fence and sit in the overgrown grass, letting the sounds of horses and sheep drift over him. On the morning after Valiant arrived, Leo found himself wandering back to that same spot. He didn't know why, only that something inside him felt heavy, and the world inside the care home had become too tight, too loud. He slipped out before breakfast, his shoes barely making a sound on the wet grass. The sanctuary was quiet. Mist clung to the fields, softening the edges of everything. Leo crouched near the fence, knees hugged to his chest, chin on his arms, letting the silence settle. He noticed the horse right away. Even without the fancy harness or the proud bearing, there was something different about him. Something in the way he stood, half turned from the other horses, eyes fixed on a point far away. Leo didn't know this was the famous drum horse from the parade, didn't know about broken legs or lost crowns. All he saw was an animal who seemed to exist in his own world, alone among many. That first day, Leo didn't approach. He just watched, letting the slow rhythm of the horse's breath steady his own. He returned the next day and the day after, always choosing the same spot by the fence, always sitting still, never calling out. Days blurred together. Sometimes he'd bring a crust of bread saved from dinner or an apple swiped from the care home kitchen. He'd set it near the fence and back away, not wanting to spook the horse, not really expecting anything in return. Valiant, for his part, ignored all the other visitors. He turned his head when Leo came, his ears flicking at the sound of the boy's footsteps. At first, he wouldn't eat the offerings, just stared at them for hours, as if weighing the risk. But eventually, hunger or curiosity won out, and he'd nibble at the apple, careful and slow, his eyes never leaving the boy. Their bond grew in silence. There were no whispered promises, no magical moments of understanding. Just two outcasts, each rejected by their own kind, learning to share space without fear. Other horses avoided Valiant, the other kids shunned Leo. But in that small patch of grass by the sanctuary fence, something like trust began to grow. Invisible and fragile, but real. One afternoon, the old caretaker, Arthur, noticed the strange pair. Arthur had been at the sanctuary longer than anyone, a man with a weathered face and gentle hands. He watched from a distance at first, curious about the quiet boy who never spoke and the legendary horse who finally seemed to care about something again. Arthur had seen many animals come and go, many children pass through, but this was different. Arthur approached Leo one day, holding a battered mug of tea. "You like horses, then?" he asked, his voice soft, more statement than question. Leo shrugged, not meeting Arthur's eyes. "I guess." Arthur nodded, settling onto the grass beside him. For a while, they just watched Valiant together. "That one there's special," Arthur said finally. "Used to lead parades. Never seen a horse prouder or lonelier than him. Since he came here, he's hardly touched his food. Didn't want to be touched. Didn't want to live, if you ask me." Leo stayed silent, but something shifted in his posture. Arthur continued. "But lately, he waits. Every morning, I find him near this fence, looking out. I think he's waiting for you." Leo's cheeks flushed, but he didn't reply. In his chest, something unfamiliar twisted, half hope, half fear. He'd never had anyone wait for him before. Arthur stood up, leaving Leo with his thoughts. "Sometimes, all it takes is one friend to remind you what it means to belong. You keep coming if you want. No one'll stop you here." As the sun began to set, Leo looked at Valiant, the great white horse still standing alone, but not as far away as before. For the first time in a long time, Leo felt less like a ghost, more like someone real. Someone who could make a difference, even if it was just to one lost king. The sanctuary faded into twilight. The fences, the fields, the scars, all of it softened under the evening light. Two outsiders, battered but not broken, kept watch over each other in the gathering dusk. For the first time, neither one felt entirely alone. For a time, the days at the sanctuary slipped into a gentle rhythm, like the hush that falls after a storm, but before the next one arrives. Leo found himself waking with the sunrise, stomach tight with a nervous energy that was half dread, half anticipation. He'd sneak out of the care home at every chance, shoes caked with mud, jacket barely enough against the cold English mist. Each morning, he'd find Valiant waiting, sometimes with his head low, but always facing the fence, as if expecting Leo's arrival. It became their quiet ritual. Leo never said much. He wasn't sure what to say, or if words would even matter. Instead, he'd help Arthur with the morning chores, shoveling hay and muck with awkward hands, glancing every so often at the white horse in the next stall. Arthur showed him how to groom Valiant, how to brush the tangled mane and wipe the mud from his scarred leg. At first, Valiant shied away from the brush, his body tensing, nostrils flaring. But Leo moved slowly, gently, never forcing, always waiting for permission. It was a delicate dance, two creatures learning how to trust again, each teaching the other by simply being present. Sometimes, the mornings were filled with the simple sounds of sanctuary life. The soft snort of horses, the clatter of buckets, Arthur humming an old song under his breath. Leo let himself be absorbed in these small moments, the world narrowing to the rhythm of the brush through Valiant's coat, the rise and fall of the horse's breath. He noticed how Valiant's ears flicked toward him, how his eyes slowly lost some of their haunted look. There were days when the scar didn't seem quite so raw, when the limp was less pronounced. Maybe it was just the sunlight, or maybe it was something more. Arthur watched this transformation with a kind of cautious hope. He never said much, but sometimes, after Leo left, he'd linger in the stable, stroking Valiant's neck, whispering stories of old parades and golden afternoons. "He needs you, old boy," he'd say softly, voice rough with memory. "You both do." Then, one gray afternoon, the routine was quietly shattered. Leo was sweeping out the far stall when he heard the crunch of tires on the gravel drive. A woman in a crisp suit stepped out, her shoes too clean for the mud, her smile too wide to be real. Arthur recognized her instantly, a social worker from the care home. Leo felt his heart sink, a cold knot forming in his chest. She greeted Arthur, her tone professional, but her eyes flickered to Leo with a kind of forced warmth. "I have wonderful news," she announced, as if reading from a script. "Leo, we found a family for you. They live in Cornwall, a beautiful place by the sea. You'll love it there." Arthur glanced at Leo, searching for a reaction, but the boy's face gave nothing away. He just stood there, broom in hand, staring past the woman at the gray sky beyond the paddocks. Valiant, sensing the tension, let out a soft nicker, pressing his head against the fence. The woman continued, oblivious. "You'll have your own room, new school, new friends, a real fresh start." She paused, waiting for a smile, for gratitude. Leo only nodded, the movement small and stiff. After she left, Arthur found Leo sitting in his usual spot by the fence, knees pulled up to his chest, face hidden behind his arms. For a long time, neither spoke. The wind rattled the loose boards on the barn, the sky darkening with the threat of rain. When Leo finally spoke, his voice was flat, almost calm. "I'm leaving. They say it's for the best." Arthur sat beside him, the old wood creaking under his weight. He didn't offer empty reassurances, didn't say it would all work out. Instead, he let the silence hang between them, heavy and honest. After a while, Leo looked up, his eyes dark and unblinking. "Can you promise me something?" he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Don't let him die alone. Don't let him be forgotten. He was a king once. He deserves to be remembered." Arthur swallowed hard, the words settling deep in his chest. "I promise," he said simply. "I'll remember." That night, Leo couldn't sleep. He lay awake, listening to the distant calls of the sanctuary, the creak of floorboards, the rain tapping against the window. In his mind, he replayed every moment with Valiant. The first time the horse accepted a crust of bread, the feel of his rough coat under Leo's hand, the silent understanding that had passed between them. The thought of leaving, of never seeing Valiant again, was like a stone in his stomach. In the early hours, Leo slipped outside, drawn to the sanctuary one last time. He found Valiant standing alone, eyes glistening in the moonlight. For a moment, Leo just watched him, memorizing every detail. The proud curve of his neck, the long scar down his leg, the quiet strength in his stance. He pressed his forehead against the horses and closed his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "You deserved better. We both did." The sky was just beginning to lighten when Leo turned and walked away, each step heavier than the last. He didn't look back, but he felt Valiant's gaze following him, steady and unbreakable, until the boy vanished into the coming dawn. Back in his cottage, Arthur sat by the window, watching the world grow pale with morning. He thought of promises, of kings and outcasts, of all the ways a heart could break and mend again. The storm had quieted for now, but in the stillness, a deeper fear lingered. The fear of losing something you'd only just begun to find. But as the sanctuary woke to a new day, something unspoken remained. an ember of hope, hidden but alive, waiting for the chance to burn bright once more. Arthur sat in his cottage late that night, long after the lamps in the sanctuary had been extinguished. The only light came from a small reading lamp on his battered desk, casting a soft glow over piles of paperwork, weathered photographs, and a battered box filled with yellowed clippings. The silence in the room was heavy, interrupted only by the ticking of the old clock on the wall. But Arthur couldn't sleep, not after the promise he'd made, and not with the memory of Leo's solemn plea echoing in his ears. He reached for the box, hands trembling a little more than usual. He'd saved every scrap about Valiant since the day the great horse first arrived in the regiment. Here were headlines from glossy magazines. The Crown's prized drum horse. Valiant leads the parade once more. And photos. Valiant rearing under a cascade of confetti. Valiant nuzzling a small child in a wheelchair. Valiant flanked by soldiers in parade dress, all eyes on him. To Arthur, these weren't just mementos. They were proof that Valiant had once mattered to the world. But now, Arthur glanced at the latest photo. Valiant, older, thinner, coat a little dull, standing beside Leo in the golden haze of a late afternoon. Leo was brushing Valiant's mane, his face focused and careful, as if the act itself was a kind of worship. Arthur had snapped that photo secretly, not wanting to break the spell of that gentle moment. That was the image he kept coming back to. A fallen king and a lonely boy, saving each other in small, unseen ways. Arthur pulled out a sheet of paper. He sat for a long time, the pen hovering above the page. This wasn't a letter of desperation, he decided, nor a plea for charity. Valiant, for all his scars, deserved better than that. No, this would be a report, written in the tone of duty and respect, as if the horse's fate were still a matter for the highest offices. Maybe it was. He wrote in careful, slanting handwriting. He described Valiant's glory days in the regiment, how he'd never faltered in a parade, how the soldiers had drawn courage just from seeing him step onto the mall. He recounted the accident in plain terms, not shying away from the details, refusing to let time smooth over the cruelty of that moment. Then he spoke of Valiant's time at the sanctuary, his loneliness, his limp, his slow slide into obscurity. But Arthur didn't stop there. He wrote of Leo, the quiet, sharp-eyed boy who'd appeared out of nowhere and changed everything. "I am not asking for sympathy," Arthur wrote. "I am reporting an act of heroism, one that has nothing to do with medals or uniforms. In the boy, the horse found hope. In the horse, the boy found belonging. I believe you ought to know." Arthur included the two photos, one from Valiant's prime, leading the parade, one of Leo brushing his mane. He hesitated, then tucked a copy of Leo's short letter, written in blocky, uncertain handwriting, into the envelope as well. All it said was, "Thank you for letting me be his friend." He knew he couldn't just send this to some generic address. Letters like that disappeared into bureaucracy, lost among hundreds of others begging for favors or mercy. But Arthur still had one connection that mattered. Years ago, he'd helped a young officer, James Davies, through his first days in the regiment. Davies had grown up fast, sharp and principled, the kind of man who'd take a stand even when it cost him. Arthur trusted him, not because he was important, but because he still cared. He addressed the letter to Captain James Davies, Household Cavalry, marking it private and confidential. It felt right, like passing the torch to someone who might still remember what honor really meant. When he sealed the envelope, Arthur felt something shift inside him, a mix of relief and fear. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but at least he had kept his word to Leo. He had done what he could. The next morning dawned cold and damp. Arthur watched as the sanctuary woke up, the animals stirring, the mist curling over the grass. He saw Leo one last time, packing his small bag, eyes red but determined. They didn't say much. Leo simply nodded at Arthur, then turned to Valiant, who leaned into the boy's hand, nostrils flaring, breath warm against Leo's palm. "Goodbye, old friend," Leo murmured, Remember me." Arthur put his hand on the boy's shoulder, steady and strong. "He'll remember. So will I." The care home van came and went, taking Leo away to a new world, a new family, a future he couldn't yet imagine. Arthur stood in the doorway long after they disappeared, feeling the ache of loss settle into his bones. Back inside, he stared at the empty chair, the letter now on its way to London. He hoped, no, he trusted that someone would read it and understand. This wasn't about saving a horse or even a child. It was about honoring what mattered: loyalty, dignity, and the small acts of kindness that keep the world from turning cold. That afternoon, Arthur went out to Valiant's paddock. The horse stood alone, as always, but when he saw Arthur, he walked over. Slower than he once had, but with a bit more purpose. Arthur stroked his nose and whispered, "The world hasn't forgotten you, not yet. Let's see what tomorrow brings, eh?" As dusk settled, the sanctuary seemed to hold its breath, caught in a space between hope and memory. Somewhere far away, a letter moved through the city, carrying with it the weight of a promise and the last desperate wish of a boy who believed that even fallen kings deserved to be remembered. Arthur stood by the fence until the stars appeared, the silence around him both comforting and impossibly vast. He'd done all he could. Now it was up to fate, and perhaps a little courage, to decide what would come next. The morning air in London was sharp and cool when Captain James Davies arrived at the barracks, the city still drowsy under a blanket of fog. His uniform was immaculate, every brass button shining, but his thoughts were elsewhere, still lingering on the letter that had arrived the night before. He'd read it twice, then a third time, unable to shake the image of the fallen king and the lonely boy. The photos haunted him. Valiant's proud bearing from the parade, then the quiet, almost sacred trust between horse and child. The regiment taught loyalty as a creed, but Davies felt a deeper ache, something old and stubborn rising in his chest. He entered the officer's briefing room with the envelope tucked inside his coat, pausing at the threshold. The daily meeting had already begun, voices overlapping in a low rumble, cups of tea and stacks of paperwork scattered across the long table. At the head sat Regimental Sergeant Major Alastair Finch, his posture rigid, face carved with lines of pride and discipline. Finch's presence commanded respect, and sometimes dread. Davies waited until the hum of conversation faded, then stood tall. "Before we proceed, I'd like to bring something to the regiment's attention," he said, his voice steady but ringing with conviction. Finch barely looked up. "Is this urgent, Captain?" Davies laid the photos on the table, one by one, in silence. The room stilled. He spoke, recounting Valiant's service, the accident, and the quiet exile at the sanctuary. He described Leo's bond with the horse, not as a fairy tale, but as a matter of dignity and honor. He finished with Arthur's words, "I am not asking for a favor. I am reporting on a fallen soldier." A murmur ran through the officers, a shifting unease. One young lieutenant whispered, "He was the best we ever had." But Finch's hand came down hard, palms slamming against the table. The sound snapped the room to attention. "Absolutely not," Finch thundered, voice slicing through the quiet. "We are not a charity, and this is not a public relations campaign. The regiment's honor will not be made a mockery of for a horse and a stray kid." Davies didn't back down. "Our honor is built on loyalty. Valiant served us for a decade. There's a difference between letting go and turning our backs. What does it say about us if we forget our own?" Finch's eyes narrowed. "Honor is preserved by discipline, Captain. It's not sentiment, and it's not nostalgia. If the press gets hold of this, Royal Cavalry skips parade for lame horse, we become a laughingstock. The image we present to the crown is everything. My order is final. This is over." A heavy silence fell. Davies clenched his fists, jaw set. Every word of Finch's a cold slap. The other officers stared at the table or exchanged nervous glances. No one spoke for a long moment. But then, quietly, a different voice spoke. Major Chen, who rarely offered more than a grunt in meetings, cleared his throat. "With respect, sir, we teach our recruits that tradition is built on acts of loyalty, not just rules. The parade isn't the only way to serve. Sometimes the hardest thing is remembering the ones who can't march anymore." Finch bristled. "You will not undermine the chain of command, Major. This is not up for debate." Davies felt the walls closing in, the suffocating grip of tradition and authority pressing down on him. But the ache in his chest remained, an ache that felt too much like conscience to ignore. He gathered up the photos and Arthur's letter, tucking them carefully back into the envelope. As the meeting ended, Finch called after him, voice cold and final. "I will not have my orders questioned, Captain. If you pursue this further, you'll answer for it." Davies paused at the door, glancing back at the table, the faces of his fellow officers, a mixture of sympathy and fear. He wondered if they remembered how many times Valiant had led them, how often the horse's steady presence had calmed their nerves before a parade, how he had once been more than just a symbol. Outside, Davies leaned against the wall, breath coming in hard, short bursts. He ran his thumb over the edge of the envelope, feeling the weight of Arthur's plea. He knew the cost of defiance. His career, maybe even his future in the regiment, hung in the balance. But somewhere deep down, a part of him refused to let go. Not yet. Down in the barracks, word spread quickly. Private Owens Hughes, a soldier with quick fingers and a knack for technology, found Davies in the corridor, eyes bright with a kind of nervous energy. "Sir, I heard what happened. Some of us, we remember Valiant. We talk about him, online, in the forum. People still care." Davies nodded, the kernel of an idea forming in his mind. Maybe the chain of command had drawn its line in the sand, but there were other ways to honor a promise. He watched as Hughes hurried away, the possibility of rebellion flickering between them, unspoken but alive. Upstairs, Finch watched from the window, his jaw tight, eyes following Davies' retreating figure. He remembered his own first parade, the pounding of his heart, the steadiness of the white drum horse leading the way. But the burden of tradition weighed heavier than memory. For Finch, rules were the bedrock of survival. For Davies, perhaps, there was room for something more. In that moment, two visions of loyalty, one rigid, one rebellious, collided beneath the gray London sky. The regiment's honor would be tested, not by the roar of the parade ground, but by a choice made in the quiet space between duty and conscience. As the sun set over the city, the weight of old promises and new hopes pressed on them all. And somewhere, far from the barracks, a horse stood alone, waiting for someone to remember what it meant to be king. Captain Davies sat in the shadowy silence of his small office, the envelope with Arthur's letter and Leo's drawing resting on the edge of his desk. Outside the window, the city hummed and flickered, but inside the barracks, the weight of unspoken disappointment pressed in from every side. He'd spent the day going through the motions, his mind a blur of conflicting orders, memories, and stubborn ache. The regiment's daily life went on as if nothing had changed. Boots polished, drills executed, uniforms pressed to perfection. Yet something had shifted in Davies. The question echoed in his mind. When does following the rules become a betrayal of what's right? A knock on his door jolted him out of thought. Private Owen Hughes slipped in, closing the door behind him with a quick, nervous glance over his shoulder. Hughes was the youngest in Davies' troop, quick-witted, eternally online, always a step ahead when it came to technology and the unofficial flow of information. "Sir," Hughes began, voice low, "I've been thinking about Valiant, about all of this." He hesitated, holding out his phone. "I know you said not to push, but look at this." Davies took the phone. On the screen was a simple blog, Valiant's diary. Photos, little stories, memories posted every week. Arthur had written most of them, painting pictures of Valiant's old glory and the quieter, gentler days at the sanctuary. There were comments too, a small but passionate community. Old soldiers who remembered the parades, children who'd once petted Valiant at public shows, horse lovers from across the country. We miss you, old friend. You gave me courage when I needed it. Dozens of names, dozens of hearts still beating for the forgotten king. It's not just us, sir, Hughes said, his voice trembling with excitement and a touch of fear. There are people out there who still care, maybe more than you'd think. Davy's mind spun. The rules were clear, but the heart of the regiment, the spirit, the loyalty, was harder to define, and harder still to kill. He stared at the blog, at the tiny digital echo of Valiant's legacy. A loophole, thin, risky, but real, began to take shape. He leaned forward, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. What if we don't break orders? Not exactly. Finch said no official visit, but there's nothing in the books about a peripheral ceremonial drill, a test of our readiness, a show of skills outside normal parameters. He raised his eyebrows. Military jargon, vague as mud, just enough to keep us in the clear, unless someone looks too close. Hughes's eyes widened. You mean we go anyway? For Valiant? For Leo? Davies nodded. Not a parade, not a public spectacle. Just a few soldiers paying their respects. The king deserves more than silence. If anyone asks, we're conducting a rapid deployment drill, unscheduled, peripheral, nothing more. He almost smiled, a rush of adrenaline warming the ache in his chest. The risk was real. Finch would have their heads if he found out. But Davies felt clarity for the first time in days. Some orders were meant to be questioned. Some traditions demanded to be challenged. He looked Hughes dead in the eye. If you're in, there's no going back. This isn't a joke. If this blows up, you and anyone who joins me could lose everything. Hughes squared his shoulders, a grin spreading across his face. Sir, I'm in. This is what I signed up for, not just marching in circles. They moved quickly. Davies called Corporal Sutton, a quiet, stoic man with a reputation for following orders to the letter, but who rumor had it owed his career to a narrow save from Valiant on his very first parade. Sutton arrived at Davies' office, eyes wary but steady. Davies explained the plan in hushed tones. Sutton listened, silent for a long moment. Then he nodded, slow and solemn. Valiant saved me once. I owe him more than I can say. The three of them, Davies, Hughes, Sutton, began their secret preparations. They met late at night, when the barracks were quiet, uniforms tucked beneath armfuls of laundry, ceremonial harnesses carefully polished by hand. Hughes handled the logistics, checking online maps, tracking the sanctuary schedule, and crafting a careful set of alibis. Sutton handled the uniforms, making sure every detail was perfect, every button gleaming, every stripe crisp and correct. Davies took responsibility for the route, mapping the fastest way out of the city without drawing attention, using his own battered sedan instead of an official vehicle. The risk of being discovered was everywhere. Finch prowled the halls, his intuition sharp, his gaze hawkish for any sign of trouble. Davies instructed everyone to keep their heads down, to answer no questions, to act as if the world was exactly as it should be. But underneath, the tension built, a secret current of rebellion humming in the bones of every man involved. The night before they were to leave, Davies stood alone in the armory, sword in hand. He looked at his reflection in the polished steel, the memories of every parade, every act of loyalty, every moment Valiant had carried them all. He slid the sword into its scabbard, heart pounding. This wasn't just a drill, and it wasn't just for Valiant. It was for everyone who had ever felt forgotten by the machinery of tradition. Before dawn, the three soldiers slipped out, uniforms hidden beneath heavy coats, faces set with resolve. They drove through the silent city, streetlights flickering over empty roads, their destination secret and sacred. No banners, no music, just the weight of honor and the fire of defiance burning quietly in their hearts. As the sanctuary came into view, the first hints of daylight breaking through the mist, Davies felt a surge of something fierce and bright, a sense that, for the first time in a long time, they were doing not just what was allowed, but what was right. The world seemed to hold its breath as Davies' old sedan rolled through the winding back roads toward the sanctuary, the horizon stained with the pale promise of dawn. Davies gripped the steering wheel, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror again and again, as if expecting flashing lights or Finch's hard silhouette barreling after them. Hughes, normally quick with a joke or some story from his online life, was silent in the back seat, his fingers absently checking and rechecking the polish on his ceremonial boots. Sutton rode shotgun, face unreadable, but his hand resting protectively on the sword that would be drawn only for royalty were the highest acts of honor. Every mile was a risk, every moment an unspoken dare to fate and the traditions that had shaped their entire lives. Davies found his mind turning over every consequence, a formal inquiry, disgrace, being cast out of the very regiment that had defined him. But underneath the fear, something else pulsed, something like conviction, growing stronger with every passing field and signpost. They weren't just breaking rules, they were mending something far older, far more fragile. At the edge of the sanctuary, the sedan rolled to a quiet stop behind a row of tangled hedges. The soldiers stepped out, the morning air biting at their faces, hearts pounding as they shrugged off heavy coats and revealed the full ceremonial uniforms beneath. Scarlet, navy, gold, the colors glinting in the new sun. Sutton checked his gloves one last time, Hughes adjusted his cap, and Davies pulled out the sword, the steel silent and gleaming in the cold. Inside the sanctuary, Arthur was already awake, tending to the horses. He paused, hearing the crunch of gravel and the low murmur of voices, something unfamiliar but not unwelcome. He walked toward the gate, breath misting in the chill, and stopped short at the sight before him. 3 soldiers, unmistakable in their regalia, stood just outside the paddock fence, back straight, faces solemn. Leo was there too. He had returned to the sanctuary before his journey to Cornwall, hoping for one last goodbye, a quiet moment with Valiant, maybe a whispered promise that neither of them would forget. But the sight of the soldiers took his breath away. For a moment, he was too stunned to move. Davies met Arthur's eyes, then nodded to Leo, his gaze steady and kind. He said nothing. Words he knew would only diminish what they were about to do. Instead, he led the small procession into the paddock. Valiant stood in the far corner, his white coat almost silver in the morning light, eyes wide with something that looked like disbelief. The soldiers approached in silence, boots muffled by the wet grass, their formation as perfect as any on parade. Hughes's hand trembled slightly, but Sutton's was steady. The moment they reached Valiant, they halted in a line, their movements crisp and precise. Davies stepped forward, drawing his ceremonial sword in one smooth motion. The blade flashed, catching the sunrise, and the silence seemed to deepen. Every bird, every breath, every heartbeat held in suspension. Davies raised the sword in a formal salute, his voice ringing clear and proud. On behalf of loyalty and service, the Household Cavalry Regiment acknowledges the duty of Drum Horse Valiant. For a moment, the world stopped. The wind eased. The light seemed to grow brighter. And Valiant, scarred, limping, forgotten by the world, lifted his head. His chest swelled, as if drawing in the strength of every memory, every parade, every act of courage that had shaped him. He let out a long, clear neigh that echoed across the sanctuary, a cry of life and pride, so powerful it brought tears to Arthur's eyes and made Leo's heart leap in his chest. Hughes and Sutton snapped to attention, saluting Valiant as if he were the king himself. The formal pageantry, practiced countless times for the eyes of royalty and dignitaries, became here something sacred and personal. There was no audience, no applause, just the open sky, the quiet fields, and a few souls who understood what honor truly meant. Leo watched from the fence, trembling with a feeling he didn't recognize. The soldier's act wasn't a gift, wasn't charity or pity. It was justice, a moment when the world, if only for an instant, remembered what was owed to the broken and the loyal. Leo placed his hand over his heart, standing straight, his eyes locked on Valiant. He saluted, not as a soldier, but as a friend. Arthur, his voice rough with emotion, whispered, "You did it, old boy. You're a king again." As the ceremony ended, Davies slid his sword back into its scabbard, shoulders relaxing as if a great weight had lifted. He nodded to Sutton and Hughes, silent thanks and silent pride passing between them. The soldiers lingered for a moment, hands outstretched so Valiant could sniff their gloves, an old ritual, full of trust and memory. Leo stepped forward. Davies bent and handed him the hilt of the sword for a moment, letting the boy feel the cold, solid weight of tradition. "This is for you too," Davies said quietly. "You reminded us why we wear the uniform." There were no speeches, no explanations, only gratitude and the quiet wonder of knowing they had honored not just the legend, but the love and loyalty that had bound a boy, a horse, and a handful of rebels together. In that unlikely parade, every soul stood a little taller, every heart beat a little braver. As the sun rose higher and the mist burned away, the sanctuary returned to its gentle routines, but something had changed. The memory of that morning would linger, not just in photographs or stories, but in the hearts of those who'd witnessed an act of rebellion and an act of love. The morning lingered in a golden hush long after the last salute faded, as if the sanctuary itself was reluctant to let go of what had just transpired. The air was thick with unspoken gratitude, a kind of quiet awe, as if those present understood that something sacred had taken place. Even the animals sensed the change. The other horses drifted closer to the fence, their usual wariness replaced by curiosity, drawn by the energy that pulsed through the field like the distant echo of a drum. Leo stood at Valiant's side, his hand resting on the horse's neck. For the first time since he could remember, the world felt right, like he'd stepped into a story he never believed could be his. The soldiers lingered, removing their ceremonial gloves with reverent care. Hughes wiped at his eyes, trying to laugh off the tears, while Sutton simply gazed at Valiant, his normally stoic face softened by pride. Arthur watched them all, his heart pounding with a strange youthful excitement he hadn't felt in years. He moved forward, hands trembling only a little as he reached out to clasp Davies' shoulder. "Thank you," Arthur whispered. "You don't know what this means, not just for Valiant, but for all of us." Davies nodded, his expression serious. "You're wrong about that, sir. I think we do." But the moment of peace was brief. In the sanctuary's small office, Arthur's phone buzzed, a sound that felt alien in the aftermath of so much ceremony. Arthur glanced at the screen and frowned, then called Leo and Davies inside. "There's been a call from the care home," he said quietly. "They'll be here soon. Leo, it's time." The weight of goodbye settled heavily in the room. Leo's chest tightened, a swirl of panic and sorrow threatening to spill over. He looked at Valiant, then at Davies, not sure what to say or how to hold on to what had just happened. Davies knelt down, meeting Leo's eyes. "You gave Valiant back his crown, kid, and you showed us what it means to fight for what's right." He pressed something into Leo's palm, a small, worn medal from his own uniform, the kind reserved for acts of courage that rarely made headlines. "No matter where you go, remember, you belonged here. You made a difference." Leo clutched the medal so hard it left an imprint on his skin. "I'll never forget him," he whispered, "or any of you." Outside, the car pulled up, its engine idling in the driveway. The moment seemed to stretch, time slowing around the pain of parting. Arthur embraced Leo, his arms strong but gentle, and whispered, "You're braver than you think, lad. Promise you'll find your place. Promise you'll remember who you are." "I promise," Leo replied, the words thick in his throat. As Leo walked to the car, Valiant followed him to the gate, limping but proud, stopping just before the threshold. The horse lowered his great head, and Leo hugged him tightly, pressing his face into the white mane, breathing in the smell of hay and summer and the quiet strength that had carried them both this far. For a moment, neither moved. The social worker called gently, "Leo, we have to go." Leo stepped back, his eyes shining, and gave a final salute, a gesture he'd learned from the men who'd risked everything for a moment of honor. "Goodbye, Valiant. Be strong. Don't forget me." As the car pulled away, Leo kept his face pressed to the window, watching the sanctuary grow smaller and smaller until it vanished into the trees and hills. He didn't cry, not exactly, but a hot ache filled his chest, both loss and gratitude, knowing that what had happened could never truly be taken from him. Back in the paddock, Valiant stood at the fence long after the car disappeared, his head held high. For the first time since the accident, he wasn't alone. The other horses drew near, emboldened by the ceremony, and Valiant let them come, no longer in exile, but once again a leader. The soldiers returned to their car, still in their dress uniforms, and drove in silence through the winding roads. There was relief, but also a somber awareness of what they'd risked. At a crossroads, Davis pulled over. "Whatever happens next, I want you both to know, I'd do it again," he said. Hughes grinned, Sutton nodded, and for a moment the world seemed lighter. They changed out of their uniforms before reaching the city, carefully storing every piece, their secrets safe for now. But they knew, especially Davis, that the choice they'd made would not go unnoticed forever. There would be questions, there might be consequences. But none of that could diminish what they'd done. At the sanctuary, Arthur fed Valiant by hand that evening, the old horse eating with more vigor than he'd shown in months. Arthur stroked his neck and spoke softly, as if sharing the news with an old friend. "You did good today, boy. You showed them all what real honor looks like." Night fell, gentle and quiet, wrapping the sanctuary in a calm that felt earned. In the darkness, Arthur sat with Valiant, looking up at the stars. He thought of Leo on the road to his new life, of the soldiers heading back to face whatever waited for them, of the bond that had brought them all together for this one perfect act of defiance and loyalty. And somewhere in the hush between day and night, it seemed to Arthur that the world had changed, just a little, just enough. Valiant's parade had not been for the crowds, or the cameras, or even the old rituals. It had been for the heart, for the unseen courage that keeps us all moving forward no matter how broken we become. Back in London, the barracks hummed with the familiar sounds of discipline. Boots striking polished floors, the sharp calls of orders, the metallic ring of morning drills. But beneath the surface, there was an unusual tension, a ripple moving through the ranks. News of Captain Davies's unsanctioned ceremonial drill had begun to circulate, first as whispers in the mess hall, then as sharp glances and hurried conversations in quiet corners. It wasn't just that Davies, Hughes, and Sutton had been seen leaving early, dressed in full regalia. It was the sense that something sacred, something forbidden, had happened outside the rigid lines of military tradition. It didn't take long for Regimental Sergeant Major Finch to hear the rumors. He stormed through the corridors like a thundercloud, his jaw clenched, eyes narrowed, the force of his authority pressing down on everyone in his path. When he summoned Captain Davies to the command room, the air itself seemed to tighten, as if the walls were bracing for what was to come. Davis entered the room with measured steps, chin held high, eyes steady. He wasn't surprised to find Finch waiting for him, arms crossed, a stack of disciplinary forms laid out on the table like weapons. The sunlight angled in through the tall windows, slicing the room into sharp shadows. "You broke every rule in the book," Finch thundered, his voice echoing off the stone walls. You think your sentimentality justifies insubordination? You took men, you took ceremonial property, and you staged a parade for a broken-down horse and a runaway child? What do you have to say for yourself, Captain? Davis didn't flinch. He didn't reach for excuses or appeal to the emotional spectacle of what had happened at the sanctuary. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. Leo's drawing, the farewell gift given to him just before the soldiers left the sanctuary. He placed it carefully on the desk between them and stepped back. Finch glanced at it with a sneer, prepared to dismiss it as childish nonsense, but his eyes caught on the image. A simple, almost crude sketch of Valiant standing tall, 3 soldiers at his side, and a boy with a hand over his heart. Beneath the drawing, in blocky, uneven handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for giving my friend his crown back." The command room fell silent. Outside, a bugle call sounded, distant and ceremonial, but inside, the silence grew dense, heavy with things unsaid. Davies finally spoke, his tone low but firm. "You taught us that discipline is the backbone of the regiment, sir. You're not wrong. But sometimes the spirit of the rule matters more than the letter. We serve to protect the values that make the uniform mean something: loyalty, dignity, the willingness to see each other as more than just cogs in a machine. What we did was not about undermining you or the regiment. It was about honoring what makes us worthy of service in the first place." For a long moment, Finch said nothing. He stared at the drawing, the lines of his face unreadable. The memories flickered behind his eyes. His first parade, the terror and pride he'd felt, the sight of Valiant's steady form leading the line. He remembered how that presence had grounded him, made him believe he could be part of something bigger than himself. He thought of the weight of tradition, the rules he'd clung to, the honor he'd spent a lifetime defending. The narrator's voice echoed in the silence. Finch was not wrong. Discipline is the backbone of the army. But Davies had reminded him of something more important. What is the purpose of that discipline? It is to protect values, and the highest values are loyalty and dignity. For the first time, Finch saw the conflict between obeying the rule and upholding the spirit of the rule. Finch picked up the drawing, his hands unexpectedly gentle. He studied it, the crude lines, the hope in the child's message, and the echo of something he'd nearly forgotten. A heavy sigh escaped him, a sound more weary than angry. He looked at Davies, his expression softening just a fraction. "Put it away, Captain, and don't ever do this again, unless it's absolutely necessary." The words hung in the air, a quiet admission, a lesson learned. The tension in the room ebbed, replaced by a strange, tentative respect. Finch wasn't offering absolution, but he wasn't delivering condemnation either. He was acknowledging, in his own way, that tradition without heart is an empty thing. Davies nodded, relief and gratitude flickering in his eyes. He took the drawing, folded it carefully, and placed it in his breast pocket. As he turned to leave, Finch called after him, voice softer now. "Captain, don't forget what you stood for today. Sometimes the hardest thing in this job is remembering when to bend and when to stand firm." Outside the command room, Davies paused, letting the moment sink in. He knew there would still be consequences, paperwork, perhaps an official warning, rumors to endure. But he also knew something had changed. A ripple had run through the regiment, subtle but profound. Men and women who'd seen only rigid lines of duty now glimpsed something else, an honor that lived not just in ceremony, but in compassion, in the courage to risk for what's right. In the barracks, word of what happened in the command room spread fast. Some whispered that Davies had barely escaped ruin. Others marveled at Finch's rare moment of mercy. But all agreed that something different, something important, had taken root. A lesson that tradition must serve humanity, not enslave it. As evening fell and the city's lights flickered on, Davies pinned Leo's drawing to the wall of his office, a private reminder of the day they'd chosen to be more than just soldiers. And somewhere, in the hush of the sanctuary, Valiant stood beneath the stars, no longer a broken king, but a living symbol of the loyalty that unites the best among us. Time moved on, but echoes of that extraordinary day lingered in quiet corners, tucked into memories, nestled in gestures, threaded through the lives of everyone who had been shaped by Valiant and Leo. The world outside, as it always does, returned to its routines. Parades went on, uniforms gleamed, orders were shouted and obeyed, boots striking stone in perfect rhythm. But for a handful of people, one boy, one old horse, 3 brave soldiers, and an old caretaker, the story had left its mark, shaping the days and years that followed. Leo found himself in Cornwall, far from London, far from everything that had once defined him. His new family lived in a small cottage perched on a windswept hill, the sea glimmering at the horizon. The first weeks were hard, new faces, new voices, new rules. At night, he would lie awake listening to the waves crash against the cliffs, the loneliness pressing in from all sides. But on his dresser, in a place of honor, stood a framed photograph. Leo brushing Valiant's mane, sunlight caught in the horse's white coat, a look of peace between them that words could never capture. Next to it, Davy's medal gleamed in the morning light, a weighty, real thing, proof that what he'd felt, what he'd done, was more than just a dream. He started school, quieter than the others, wary but watchful. Some days he would get lost in memories of the sanctuary, Arthur's steady hands, the sound of horses snuffling at the fence, the gentle weight of Valiant's head resting against his chest. When the world felt too loud, Leo would close his eyes and remember the ceremony, the moment when everything had made sense, when honor and belonging had found him at last. Slowly, he grew. He learned the language of the sea, the names of the gulls, the taste of salt on the wind. He found a friend, then another. One afternoon, he saw a girl in his class standing alone at recess, ignored by the others, and for the first time in his life, Leo walked over and sat beside her. He didn't say much, but his presence meant everything. That small act, offered with quiet loyalty, became the beginning of something new. The lesson Valiant had taught him, that the smallest act of recognition can change a life, guided Leo into the future. Back in London, Davies faced the fallout of his actions. There was paperwork, plenty of it, formal warnings, stern lectures behind closed doors, sidelong glances in the mess. But in his private office, hidden from the eyes of the regiment, Leo's drawing remained pinned to the wall. Valiant crowned once more, 3 soldiers at his side, a boy saluting. Every time Davies looked at it, he remembered not just what they had risked, but why. Sutton and Hughes were never reprimanded publicly. Instead, Davies made sure they were quietly recognized. Extra leave, a word of praise passed down from the top, a handshake that lingered a moment longer than usual. The regiment, too, began to change, slowly, subtly, like grass growing after a long winter. Stories of Valiant's last parade made their way through the ranks, often whispered in the barracks at night. Young recruits, who had never marched behind the great drum horse, listened wide-eyed as older soldiers described the day. Tradition bowed to something greater. Even Finch, for all his gruffness, carried himself a little differently. He became just a bit softer when talking about the past, and on more than one occasion was seen standing quietly before the parade photographs, hands clasped behind his back, lost in thought. At the sanctuary, Arthur kept his promise. He cared for Valiant as the seasons changed, through the cold snap of winter, the rains of spring, the lazy warmth of summer. The other horses accepted Valiant again, following his lead to the shelter in a storm, sharing their hay without a challenge. Sometimes, visitors would ask about the old white horse in the field. Arthur would smile, point to the scar along Valiant's hind leg, and tell them he was a king once, Still is, if you ask me. He kept Leo's letters, short, hopeful, always signed with love, in a drawer by his bed. One autumn evening, Arthur found Valiant standing at the far end of the paddock, the sun setting behind him. The horse lifted his head, as if listening for something just out of reach. A distant drum, a boy's laughter, the memory of a parade that had changed everything. Arthur walked over and stroked his neck. "You did more than anyone could have asked, old friend. You gave us all a reason to believe." And so life settled into a new rhythm. The world moved forward, but the legacy of loyalty remained, quiet, steady, indelible. It lingered in the touch of a child's hand, the resolve in a soldier's salute, the gentleness of a caretaker's whisper. It echoed in every act of courage done in secret, every kindness that went unseen, every promise kept when no one was watching. In the final narration, the story closed on a deeper lesson: true honor. This story isn't just about kindness. It's a question about the nature of honor. Honor isn't a gleaming uniform or a perfect parade. Honor is doing the right thing when no one is watching, and keeping your promise to the most vulnerable. The three soldiers risked their careers, not for a boy, but for the very soul of the uniform they wore. The power of recognition. Valiant didn't need to be healed. Leo didn't need a new family. What they truly needed was to be seen. Valiant needed to be recognized as a hero. Leo needed to be recognized as a loyal friend. The soldier's act gave them that. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is to simply say, "I see you. Your worth is recognized." As the last words faded, the story ended not with the roar of a parade, but with the gentle, persistent beat of hearts still loyal, still brave, still remembering what truly matters. In a world obsessed with power and status, the story of Valiant and Leo reminds us that the greatest loyalty isn't always written on a medal, but is etched in the heart. And sometimes an order of defiance is the highest act of obedience to something we call humanity.